So thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. Uh, I am sitting on my sofa in my front room, so I do look slightly more relaxed. But I just wanted to say, yeah, again, thanks very much for inviting me, and also to Bertie as well. I thought that was a very kind and generous introduction previously to me. Um, the one thing I will just say is that when I was invited to speak at this event today, I felt I needed to stress right from the start that I'm not a computational scientist, and my research really hasn't been in the spaces that we're kind of talking about today. There's always that kind of overlap between the online and the offline. But for me, it was an opportunity for me to kind of think through and consider and maybe put to others here those kind of ideas around what lessons have we learned from the offline spaces and how do they kind of apply in terms of the way in which we're looking at the online spaces, and is there some kind of shortcuts that we can take that will help us to be able to address this issue, maybe more meaningfully, or maybe like sort of in a more kind of kind of fast track way than we have done previously. As you'll all appreciate far more than I probably am aware, is that we are talking about spaces which are rapidly changing. We are talking about spaces where we can see multiple layers, we can see new opportunities opening, we can see all these new possibilities. And actually, in ways that it's taken us maybe 20, 30, 40 years to begin to kind of acknowledge and really understand hate crime and hate in the kind of offline spaces. We probably don't have that time to be able to do this in the online spaces. That is unless we want to really begin to kind of let these things kind of take too much root and really come to kind of like sort of that space where they come to fruition. So one of the things I just wanted to kind of also clarify was that when I'm doing my talk today, there'll be times when I'm going to give illustrations around kind of my experience of doing research with Muslim communities and that kind of experience and encounter of Islamophobia. One of the things that I've done since moving to the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester has been really about kind of having that much wider lens about looking at the kind of different forms of hate that targets different kind of groups, that targets those issues around difference and being different in a way that kind of makes me begin to see things a little bit more broadly. So when I'm talking about kind of when I'm giving kind of personal kind of stories or anecdotes or kind of illustrations, I'm talking about my own first-hand research experience. I'm not saying that actually there's any hierarchy of different forms of hate. I'm not suggesting that one is more important than the other. What I'm kind of doing is giving an illustration and acknowledging that there's similar, the way in which different discriminatory phenomena work is very similar. Each has their own specificities, each have their own histories, and the way in which they manifest and the way in which they've kind of taken root in our society, have different trajectories and histories. But the way in which they function is very similar. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that and say that I don't come at this from the point of view that there's actually one or certain types of hate which are more important than others. I think that all are kind of equally abhorrent. I also think, want to just clarify that my research really, whilst I'm in an academic setting and it's very easy to kind of look at peer-reviewed research and all these kind of books and so on, is that actually my research is about humans and about the experience of real people. And I think that sometimes, when we look at academic research, we kind of forget that. We kind of talk about a respondent, or we talk about, somebody, sort of in terms of, respondent number one or number two or so on. And in many ways that dehumanises. So the root of the research though that I've been doing is that this idea that people are very real, that their experiences are real, and it affects their real lives in ways that we probably don't understand. So I think again that's something which is really, really kind of important for us to acknowledge in terms of that. So when I was chatting beforehand and when I was first introduced to invited to speak here, I wanted to kind of acknowledge that there has been some research in the academic spaces into online hate, but my own personal view is that this kind of research has been quite superficial in many ways. I think that it's weak. I think that there's been this kind of, I think that Helen was speaking about this kind of idea, in her introduction around this kind of binary idea around kind of, what is hate online, and these kind of the binaries in the way in which we understand it. And I think that there's been some very sort of, some glaring holes which have been left in there. And I think that one of the challenges here is that for someone like myself, and possibly one of the reasons why I've been maybe a little bit more reluctant to do just purely online research, has been this idea that you're coming into something that you don't really understand, or you don't understand in the way that others do. And you can't just take your kind of findings and approaches from the kind of the kind of real world, and put those, into the virtual world. You need that collaboration, and so that's why I'm kind of really happy around this idea that that this event's going ahead, and there is this kind of reaching out across disciplines, across different sectors, to try and bring people together in terms of that. So I think that what we can see with this, though, is that in many ways it's kind of indicative of the issue. When we do research into offline hate crime, we have very clear set guidelines. We have these from the College of Policing, we have these from the CPS, and we know exactly what is a hate crime and we know exactly what isn't. We can really begin to kind of differentiate between those. From an instinctive point of view, I think that we know, and we would all agree and accept, that physically assaulting somebody, whether they are perceived to be gay, whether they're perceived to be Jewish, whether they're perceived to be disabled, or any other form of being different, is wrong. And I think that there's that instinctive view that we have in terms of that. In the same way that when somebody shouts abuse at someone in the street, we instinctively know that that's wrong, and we instinctively understand that. We may not be able to articulate it, or all of us may not be able to articulate it in kind of academic or scholarly language, but we know that it's wrong, and we can understand that very simply. I think that when we move online, that natural instinctiveness, becomes a little less clear. I think that one of the things that we kind of see there is that, things kind of maybe don't look as obvious because there's no kind of physical violence, because there's no kind of physical aggression. It becomes something which, we stand back from, we're at arm's length from, and it becomes much more difficult for that instinctiveness to kind of categorically say, yes, this is wrong, or this is not. And I think that this is where we can look at the difference between, say, hate crime and hate speech. When it comes to hate crime, we have these fixed guidelines. When it comes to hate speech, we have no real agreed definition or guidelines. It's much more kind of loosely conceived. It's much more about an expression of hatred towards a person or a group of people. And that can be done whether that's in the form of speech, writing, or other means of communication. And so already you're beginning to see that there's a much more kind of nebulous, kind of fluid kind of understanding around kind of hate speech. Of course, there is legal protections afforded to protect people from hate speech. This is done through a number of different statutes to make it offence to use threatening or kind of abusive language, kind of insulting words or behaviours that cause people to feel, harassed, alarmed, or distressed. And also we know that actually hate speech can also include inciting hatred against certain groups, and also the glorification of terrorism as well. So, so again, it's much more kind of broader than that kind of concept of hate crime. And I think that one of the pushbacks into kind of hate speech, and one of the things that I kind of see in terms of those online spaces, is the kind of pushback of the right to free speech and the off-cited perceived right to offend. I mean, I personally don't have a problem with offence. I think that we need to have that space where you can offend and you can be offended, and I don't think that offence is, in most scenarios, one and the same as hate speech. I think that they are quite different. But of course we have those limits. We know that free speech isn't absolute, and we know that we can be limited when we're looking to protect the rights of others. But of course, what we get there is we get that issue there where do we actually need to criminalise language or behaviours, just because somebody, we don't like what somebody else is saying. And I think that one of the interesting things that's kind of come out is that, in this kind of the kind of pandemic and the lockdown there, is that idea around kind of like, kind of mainstream messages, non-mainstream messages, how they can be manipulated and taken, how they can be used by different groups, and whether there's an underlying agenda around kind of hate speech which exists in there. I mean, for me personally, I feel that is still kind of an area that I would like to investigate more. But I think that it kind of gives us, again, a kind of timely reminder that actually these things are quite real. And so finding something unpleasant or offensive or something that we kind of don't agree in, we must see this as being different from inciting violence or criminality. But as I say, there's a subjective line which divides this, and all of our subjectivities will put us in slightly different places. So we need to acknowledge that when we're going onto those online spaces and looking at hate online, it maybe isn't as kind of objective, or instinctive as it is in the offline spaces. So I wanted to just kind of put that out there and kind of talk about this, because I think that one of the things that we find with the online spaces is that the things aren't maybe as black and white as people would like them to be. And when when I talk to people about the kind of offline spaces, it becomes much more kind of difficult to kind of give those kind of concrete examples. So I think that we need to proceed with caution. But I think that we need to proceed with caution in a meaningful way, because we need to begin to do this. And I think that, as I said previously, I think that that was really great what Helen said in her introduction, that, we need to move beyond those binaries, because we need to be able to look at this in kind of those much more meaningful ways. And I think that one of the things, again, referring back to what Helen said in her introduction, was that existing academic attempts to kind of devise typologies of kind of hate, typologies of perpetrators, those kind of taxonomies of kind of behaviours, for example, are vastly insufficient. So again, this is something that we should be welcoming, this kind of looking across sectors, looking across disciplines, to be able to kind of do something which actually gives us a little bit more kind of evidence, in terms of this. And so again, I think that maybe there's something there which we can draw from the offline spaces and kind of put into the online spaces. And I wonder whether one of the first ways in which we can begin to do this is by looking at the type of hate that manifests online which targets individuals rather than large communities or communities that have shared identities. So rather than, say, for example, in the context of Islamophobia, people that sort of say, the religion of Islam is evil and so on, it's kind of maybe looking at that much more about Muslims being targeted as individuals, because we understand the kind of harms, we understand the harms of hate, which actually sort of, come through in terms of that. And I think that that's something for me that I feel has something which is kind of like, kind of has the potential to be more meaningful. I think to kind of illustrate that, we can talk about this idea, well, if we, how do we kind of differentiate between this? Well, we would differentiate in the online spaces in the way in which we differentiate between, say, a Muslim woman, for example, who's wearing a hijab or a niqab, who gets physically assaulted or verbally assaulted at a bus stop, for example, from graffiti being sprayed onto the walls of a mosque, within a community context. I think that that, again, is something that we can kind of look at, and we can sort of say, that's not to say that one has the, one is more important or one is, kind of lesser, but it's a way of us kind of being able to focus and being able to take these very vast, huge spaces and actually begin to narrow our focus in terms of that. I think that one of the other questions that comes up, and again, this is something which Helen touched upon in her introduction, was this idea that, how do we begin to make the case that hate online is something that needs to be addressed. Now, I think that it's important to stress that, a lot of the times we're preaching to the converted. We're talking to people that understand this. But when we start stepping outside of these spaces, it can become much more difficult in terms of actually convincing people that something which is said online, which has an impact on someone who is actually sort of a human being and affects their lives in many ways, is actually something that we need to take seriously. Of course, that subjectivity, the kind of throwaway nature of these kind of things that are said online, to some, this can be something where, we maybe seem to be taking this too seriously. So I don't think, one of the things for me is I don't believe that, that we do need to understand the scale and the prevalence, we do need to understand it, but I don't think that there's a time when there becomes a critical kind of mass or a critical level, that's when we begin to take it serious. I think that all forms of hate, whether they're online, offline, are unwanted and unfounded, and I think that we should be able to push back on that. Having said that, the evidence base, which Helen showed towards the end of her talk in terms of like kind of beginning to construct that evidence base about the kind of scale and prevalence of online hate is actually very important. Because one of the things that we've found in terms of our research at the Centre, whether that's myself or my colleagues in the Centre for Hate Studies, it's a very laborious process in presenting evidence, because one of the things that kind of policymakers and politicians and kind of other kind of interested parties tend to want is this idea that evidence. Well, can you prove how widespread this is? When I started researching Islamophobia 20 years ago, it was the biggest question that I always encountered was people said, "Oh, but it's not a problem. It's where's the evidence base of it? If you can prove to me that this is something that's real, then we will begin to take it serious." And of course, this is something that we need to be able to be aware. We need to be aware of. So the fact that this, the Alan Turing Institute is already beginning to construct this evidence base is fantastic news, and I think think it's like it really is testament to the fact about this idea of bringing people together in terms of kind of moving forward. And I think that one of the things that where we can kind of take this across is into kind of our understanding. So, in terms of that kind of thing around kind of space, kind of prevalence and scale, I think that that's where we as social scientists can really begin to add something. Because in addition to those numbers, I think that one of the things that we need to add is we can add the more information about the way in which that hate actually harms people. Now, one of the things that we've done that's been the case when there's a physical harm is that the physical harm always takes precedent. In the online spaces, we're not going to be dealing with that. So we're going to need to be able to talk about the emotional harms. And one of the things that we know from our research is that emotional harms run deep. Emotional harms actually sort of affect people. They shape and they influence their lives, but they also ripple out much more in terms of that. And we know that people who experience hate feel anger, they feel nervous, they feel unsafe, they speak about not being able to sleep, they lose their self-confidence and so on. Now those things that we know will be vastly important when we begin to present evidence around kind of scale and prevalence, because actually in addition to just pure numbers, we need to know what the impact is. I've engaged in research in the past where I know people that have kind of like encountered hate, and they're too scared to go out, they're too scared to let their children play in the garden. You see this impact in terms of that. And so what we need to make alongside that case around the evidence base is that hate online also has the very real potential to affect and be detrimental to people's mental and physical well-being as well. And I think that one last thing that I want to kind of touch upon in terms of this, and hopefully some of these ideas will be picked up in the Q&A, is this idea that from the offline spaces, we know that actually there is a relationship between the harm that people feel and their proximity to home. That notion of home, where you feel safe, you feel secure, where you feel like you belong. When people experience hate crime close to that, we notice that the harms of hate become much more deep-seated. That's when people begin to fear their own safety, their security. When it occurs in the street, they can still come home. When it's in their own spaces, that's when it becomes much more kind of deep-seated. And one of the things that I've seen about with online hate is that actually when people experience online hate, there is a very real possibility that they will be doing that in the most personal and intimate spaces possible, on their sofa, in their bed, in their home, within those spaces that they typically was associated with being safer and secure. And I think that again is something that we can add to this debate, from those offline spaces to the online spaces. We can add that and we can bring this together and we can enhance this knowledge to show just how sort of dangerous and detrimental the kind of online hate is. I'll conclude there. I realise I've probably gone a little bit over time. I do apologise for that. But I just want to say that one of the things that I wanted to do with this was just to really raise some possible start points for additional thinking. I think it's really important that we move the research agenda forward, and I think that collaborative working is vitally important. And so I hope that some of the things I've said will kind of prompt debate or prompt some sort of additional thinking. I don't have all the answers, but being part of this agenda, being part of this process, actually is the most important thing. So thanks so much for listening, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks.